I quietly slipped away after uncovering my partner's betrayal. A year later, he sought my forgiveness and a chance to rebuild what we once had. After learning about his infidelity, I relocated to the mountains. I'm not entirely sure why I'm documenting this, but perhaps it might resonate with someone else now that the ordeal has passed and I've moved forward. After 3.5 years of marriage, I discovered my partner's affair in February 2018. I was working a contract job that sometimes required extensive travel, but it also allowed me to work from home. My partner held a well-paying position as a director in a technical sales firm. Although our relationship had become strained due to his increasingly long hours and my frequent travels, I still considered our marriage to be quite strong. 5 years ago, at a barbecue hosted by a mutual friend, I met my partner, who is now my ex. We hit it off immediately. To be honest, I felt that being with someone so charming and articulate was a significant advantage for me. My rough-around-the-edges demeanor seemed to attract him. After a few weeks of dating, we were completely smitten with each other. Whenever we met at each other's apartments, our clothes would come off in a flash. After 18 months of dating, we tied the knot and moved into a spacious apartment while saving for a down payment on a house. However, things began to shift after the first 3 years of marriage. Even though I still had feelings for him, I noticed that he would argue over trivial matters. Whenever I brought up his late nights and frequent work outings, he would become irate. He justified his long hours by claiming it was necessary for his career advancement. He insisted that since I was also away for short trips, I had no right to question him. In reality, I was only taking vacations for 3 or 4 days every 5 weeks or so, and I assured him that I could easily cut back on my travel. These arguments never reached a resolution, and looking back, I realize I was oblivious to the fact that my partner was having an affair. Aside from our dwindling intimacy and his consistently late nights, I would never have suspected anything. I simply assumed he was worn out from work. The constant rejection when I tried to initiate intimacy had taken a toll on my self-esteem. Although he had a work phone that he might have been using, I never witnessed the secretive texting that I had read about in articles. He used our spare bedroom as a home office and spent a lot of time there. Around September 2017, he began coming home from work and spending the evenings at work events instead. This escalated from 1 night a week to over 3 nights each week. While I'm not naturally a jealous person, I knew he was surrounded by women at his workplace, and I was aware that he would have to fend off some of the female executives. Despite working with more women than men, he always seemed focused on his job. The first time I suspected he was being unfaithful was a month before the day everything changed. He had made a quick stop at the grocery store before heading home, and I was asked to help him with the shopping. While retrieving some items from the back seat of his car, I noticed something blue glinting from beneath the front passenger seat. It was a pair of boxers that belonged to him. He had a preference for a specific brand, so I knew they were his. In hindsight, those boxers were a warning sign. He always took off his boxers first when he was feeling particularly lustful. The sight of them made me feel nauseous. I couldn't comprehend why they were under the seat, but I didn't say anything. My heart raced so intensely that I thought I might faint. When I returned to the kitchen with the bags, he asked how I was feeling, commenting that I looked like I had seen a ghost. I brushed off his remark, doing my best to hide my emotions. That night, I resolved to find out if he was indeed seeing someone else. The next day, I began to reflect on all the signs I might have overlooked. Aside from the boxers, I had no concrete evidence. He worked in a downtown office, and we lived in a sizable city. I decided to temporarily set aside my suspicions and focus on giving him more attention. I prepared a lovely dinner, setting the table with elegant plates, silverware, and candles. One Friday after work, I bought a beautiful bouquet of flowers and a nice bottle of wine. When he arrived, I proudly presented the meal I had prepared. As usual, he breezed in after work, but this time he apologized and said he had to go to a local hangout to meet his co-workers. He mentioned needing to shower first but could have a quick snack with me before leaving. I fell silent, my insides twisting with frustration. I won't even attempt to describe the anger I felt at that moment. I felt utterly foolish as I began pounding the steering wheel with my fist. Something inside me snapped, and I'm not sure if I had an out-of-body experience or simply blacked out, but when I came to, all I wanted was a drink. At that moment, my life took a turn I never could have anticipated. I found myself driving out of town, replaying the events I had just witnessed, tears streaming down my face, fueled by a mix of anger and heartbreak. After about 30 minutes, I stumbled upon a quaint little tavern on the outskirts of town and decided to stop in. I ordered a drink, and as I sat at the bar, the bartender, a man with a kind demeanor, commented that I looked like someone had taken the wind out of my sails. I must have looked like a ghost. I managed a half-hearted smile and replied, "You could say that." A woman sat down beside me and struck up a conversation, even though I wasn't in the mood to talk. There was something about her that made me feel at ease. As we chatted, my husband's infidelity came up. I confided in her that all I wanted was to escape him and forget he ever existed. "You're not alone, buddy," she replied, giving me a reassuring pat on the back. After a quick glance, she added, "I went through something similar a few years back. I think there's a reason these things happen. Your life can take a positive or negative turn from here on out. It's all up to you now." Her words jolted me out of my gloom. Despite my pain, I had always prided myself on my rationality, and she was absolutely right. We introduced ourselves, and her name was Rachel. I liked her down-to-earth vibe, even though she had a more country-style demeanor. "Are you planning to move out?" she asked. I hadn't even thought that far ahead. I was still in survival mode, knowing I didn't want to be around my husband any longer. Rachel continued, "I feel for you. When the time comes, I have a mobile trailer on my property that you could use. It might need some work, but it could be a good escape for you. Why don't you come by and see if you can picture yourself living in it? I'll give you a great deal." I took a moment to process her offer. The bartender chimed in, "Hell, honey, if I could have escaped my crazy ex-wife years ago, I would have jumped at the chance to live in a trailer or anything just to get my head straight. Maybe this was exactly what I needed." "Yes, I'll think about it and maybe check it out," I told Rachel. After a while, we parted ways, agreeing to meet at her place in a few days. For the first time in a while, I felt a glimmer of hope and the possibility of escaping what I thought was a terrible heartache mixed with a nightmare. One thing was certain, I never wanted to spend another moment with my husband. Cheating was something I found utterly repulsive, and it was the one thing I had always vowed I would never tolerate. When I got home that evening, I sat on the couch, and my husband, Keith, asked where I had been. "I went out for drinks," I replied, turning to face him. "Are you having an affair?" I asked directly. He looked surprised but quickly regained his composure. "No, why would you ask that?" I told him I had heard rumors about him seeing someone at work. "Who told you that?" he demanded. "Someone I know," I said, keeping the name to myself. He dismissed my concerns, calling me ridiculous and accusing me of being drunk and crazy. He then inquired about my whereabouts, suggesting we go out for drinks with friends. I could see he wanted to ask more questions, but he retreated to our bedroom and went to bed. Now that I had proof of his deceit, I decided to sleep on it. But I couldn't find rest. Images of him in bed with another woman haunted me. I felt sorry for myself, disgusted, and hurt. Yet, the thought of Rachel's trailer brought me a sense of cheer, almost like a revelation. I realized that my fight-or-flight response had kicked in amid the pain, and I preferred the flight option. The next morning, we barely spoke, and the weekend passed as if nothing had happened. A few days later, I met with Rachel. When I arrived at her ranch, I was pleasantly surprised. The trailer was actually quite nice, about 26 feet long and fully furnished. It reminded me of a fun spring break trip I had taken with friends in college. I handed Rachel the money for the trailer, and to be honest, I almost felt guilty taking it from her. After she gave me directions, I drove over. I began planning my escape while he was at work, quietly removing my belongings from the apartment and transferring them to the trailer. At least I felt like I was taking control of my situation. During this time, I noticed a change in Keith. He was being more polite, but it felt like too little, too late. I needed a break from him as well. He continued to go on company outings, and one night, as he was getting ready to leave, he glanced at me and asked where I was headed. I simply replied, "Meeting up with some friends." He started to ask more questions, but I interrupted him, recalling how he used to say the same thing whenever I asked to join him on office outings. "Alright, have a good time," he said, his expression slightly offended. "I definitely will," I replied, feeling a sense of empowerment. As I worked on the trailer and spent time with Rachel at the bar, I began to make new acquaintances. I felt better after being around Rachel's wonderful family and friends. I also decided to cut back on my drinking. I didn't want to develop any unhealthy habits. I knew it would be easy to drown my sorrows, but I was determined to stay strong. Keith informed me that he would be traveling for work the following week, mentioning that the executive team and a few department heads would be going. When I asked who was attending, I couldn't help but add, "I hope you have a great time with your girlfriend," glancing at him. I immediately regretted saying that, as it sparked a furious argument. But as Rachel had told me, it didn't really matter. I regretted not knowing more about his affair partner, but Rachel reassured me, it doesn't matter who she is. The fact that he chose to leave you is what counts. He destroyed the marriage, whether he admits it or not. Facts are facts. I thought Rachel should write a book for the betrayed. I had the perfect opportunity to move out entirely during Keith's work trip. While he was away, I gathered all my valuable belongings, clothes, laptops, and equipment, leaving behind any shared items or furniture. Before I left, I wrote a note. It started as a lengthy explanation, but I decided to keep it brief. I wrote, "I hope it was worth it," on a piece of paper and placed it on the kitchen table, along with my wedding ring. As I walked away, I felt a tremendous weight lift off my shoulders. I was liberated. I knew the hurt would take time to heal and that there would be baggage to deal with, but I had taken the first step. I needed time to myself and to swiftly and quietly rid myself of him. I didn't feel proud that I hadn't confronted him or coerced a confession. I hadn't screamed or shouted. In my opinion, he didn't deserve that. He had disregarded everything we had built together, our plans for the future, our dreams of a home and family, and now it was all gone. There was no turning back. I owed him nothing. He could face the consequences of his actions. I hadn't made any plans or contacted a lawyer. I simply wanted a fresh start and some clarity. The mountain air was just what I needed. Once I settled into my trailer, I resumed my running routine the following week, and it felt wonderful to be alive. While he was away, Keith texted me things like, "We just landed, and we're having a team dinner." I received a few messages asking, "Where are you, and why haven't you gotten back to me?" I didn't respond. My phone exploded with calls and texts. When he returned home, he kept trying to reach me, but I ignored him. His mother also attempted to call me after the first day, but I didn't pick up. He didn't try to contact my father, as we weren't close, and he was the only family member I still had. After a week of being ignored, his messages grew more urgent. "What is this?" one text read. "We need to talk. I'm not sure what you think you know, but nothing is happening. There's no affair." Finally, after a week of silence, he texted, "I'm sorry things got out of hand. It doesn't matter that I was involved with someone at work. You were absent a lot while I was focused on my job. I just made a mistake." I had been waiting for this confession all along, yet somehow, it only made me despise him more. Why couldn't he just be honest? I didn't have any desire to engage in a conversation filled with excuses. I had dreams of a future with this man, but I knew that mistakes don't linger for 6 months, 8 months, or a year. His pleas for me to return and work on our marriage eventually became pitiful. I refused to respond, even after he stopped bothering me for a few weeks. I didn't want him to find out where I lived or to snoop around in my life. I needed to protect my sanctuary from him. Then, he began sending nasty texts, calling me a coward. "You refuse to speak to me. You have no regard for us. Come home so we can discuss this. You know I can visit you, Paula. Please, let's talk and make things right." Although I don't recall all the texts, they all seemed like excuses with minimal genuine regret. I let them go in one ear and out the other. Eventually, I decided to change my phone number. In June 2018, I received an email from Keith informing me that he had hired a lawyer and was going to file for divorce. I simply replied, "Okay, that sounds good." This led to a barrage of emails requesting that I visit him. He wrote that he would stop bothering me if I consented to an uncontested divorce. After realizing this wouldn't work, I consented, and I felt genuinely free. A few months later, after moving out of our apartment, I never had to see him again. He seemed to care more about that than I did, even though neither of us had any closure. For a few months, I would occasionally think of him, and yes, the grief would hit me suddenly, like when I heard a song we used to enjoy. But eventually, I stopped thinking about him altogether. Now that I'm officially divorced, things are going great. In fact, I met a wonderful guy just down the hill from my house. I was out running on the trail when we clicked while I helped him replace a flat tire. He's a few years younger than me, but he's fantastic and quite charming. He calls me his mountain woman and adores my way of life. While I'm not in a rush to commit, I also don't plan to give up on men entirely. I have no intention of moving out of the trailer anytime soon. I enjoy being outdoors and have simplified my life. This change has made everything easier for me, including dealing with the grief over my ex-husband. I know everyone responds to these situations differently. I was fortunate to be in my 3rd year of marriage and not yet a parent. I believe I acted in my own best interests. You don't have to spend your entire life with someone who cheats. If you find yourself in a similar situation, try not to dwell on it too much. Keep living your life and focus on improving yourself, it will get better. I hope everyone finds the best possible life for themselves. I revised this account roughly 5 times to make it readable, and I wanted to give you an update on my ex-husband's condition. I was worried he might be trying to find me, as I mentioned in my earlier post. I left our previous residence, which was about 2 hours away, but I ran into him last weekend at a coffee shop I often visit in the town near my home. It didn't feel like a coincidence. Fortunately, I managed to slip away before he noticed me. This past weekend, I went into town to get groceries and stopped at my usual coffee shop. I was using their free internet to work on some paperwork when I finished and walked out. As I was heading to my car, I heard someone shout, "Paula." When I turned to look across the street, I saw Keith. My heart sank. I was face to face with my ex-husband. He hurried across the street toward me, and I stood there in disbelief, almost expecting an embrace. Instead, he extended his hand. I instinctively held out my arms with my palms up, stopping him in his tracks. He looked pained and said, "I've been searching for you, Paula. I've wanted to see you since I heard you moved here. Can we talk?" I felt like a trapped animal. "All right, let's find a table or something, and we can talk for a minute," I finally conceded. When he asked if we could go to my house, I firmly refused. Instead, he followed me to a bench outside a small store. He started by commenting on how much I had changed and how he liked my new appearance, complimenting my fitness and the way I looked in my tank top and shorts. He was clearly trying to charm me, and I had my guard up. He began by apologizing for the affair, claiming that after I left, karma had hit him hard. He explained that when his employer found out about the affair, the situation became so tense that he eventually resigned. "Do you really believe I would just forget everything?" I asked, recalling the night I watched him enter a hotel with her. I could feel my voice rising, and I noticed that people around us were starting to take notice. He grabbed my arm and began to cry. After letting him sob on my shoulder for a while, I pushed him away. "I deserve all this," he replied, glancing up at me. "I'm certain that I do. If nothing else, would you allow me to take you out to dinner?" "I'd rather not," I said firmly. "I want to talk more, but we need to be transparent about everything. You need to spend more time with me than you have in the past. Paula, please. I love you so much, even though I know you might not want to hear it. Before you left me, I had no idea how much I loved you. You broke me as much as I broke you. I can't forgive myself, and I don't want to until the day I die." He began to sob uncontrollably and hyperventilate. I lifted him up and hugged him. It felt like the only option to soothe him. In that moment, I realized I had shattered his heart as severely as he had shattered mine. We found a quiet spot to continue our conversation. "How did you find me?" I asked once he had calmed down. "Did you hire a private investigator?" After a moment of thought, he chuckled softly. "No," he said, "I ran into Steven a few weeks ago. He mentioned how things were going, and I forced him to tell me everything. I had warned him not to say anything, but he finally gave in. All he knew was that you lived nearby and were in town on your days off. So, I started coming here to check on you. I couldn't help but laugh at that, thinking, damn, Steven can't keep his mouth shut. He blushed at my reaction. We ultimately decided to have dinner at a charming little spot with a patio. I made sure we didn't drink anything. I wasn't going to give him a reason to say he was too inebriated to drive back. In fact, we had a good conversation. Afterward, I walked him to his car. He insisted that he hadn't dated anyone else since I left and vowed fervently that I was the only person he wanted. He pushed me to stay longer, but I told him, no, it's still way too early for me to go down that road. He pleaded with me to come back, but I didn't say yes. After giving him my new email address, I added, you'll just blow up my phone with texts and calls. He wept over it, but in the end, he agreed with my choice. He promised to send me an email with information about returning to town the following weekend. Before he got into his car, I asked him directly, would you have forgiven me if I had been the one cheating? Yes, in time, he replied, but only if we saw a marriage counselor and worked through the healing process with lots of talking. Maybe even a binding agreement. He paused to reflect. Alright, maybe I could do that in 5 or 10 years. I would wait if that's what it would take, he said, taking both of my hands in his and looking me in the eye. God damn it, Paula, I will always love you and will do anything to prove it. His statement caught me off guard. Even after he left, his words continued to upset me. He had spoken so firmly, yet I still couldn't envision us reuniting. While I felt better about the incident, I couldn't see him as a friend at that moment, perhaps a friend, but even that felt uncertain. When I returned home, I enjoyed a long run, had a couple of beers, and reflected on how far I had come. I wished someone could assure me that he wouldn't destroy the tranquility I had created for myself. I realized I had the luxury of time to sort through my feelings and gain perspective, but everything was still too vivid in my mind. This will likely be my final update. When I first shared my story on Reddit, the moderators kept taking it down. In summary, I ghosted my ex-husband for over a year before he found me. He wanted to make amends and start over. If you thought I would be the typical beta blue pill fool and forgive him, you would be deeply disappointed. He expressed his love and regret for the affair in a lengthy email he sent me last week, offering to come out and stay with me for the weekend. My answer? I silenced him. I told him I had no plans to make amends. I'm completely happy living alone, taking advantage of my secluded